It's recording. Hello and welcome back everybody to Gŵyl. This is the festival in translation, and boy oh boy do I have a special evening in store for you. I'd first of all like to introduce cultural critic and creative associate of the festival, Will Dawson.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
Will's main role is to sort of push me when I get a bit scared, which does excellently. So we're going to be talking tonight about Camus' The Plague, which very predictably we both bought because...
Maybe my least inspired reading choice ever.
Sales have skyrocketed very predictably. Full disclosure, I got to page 84 and I was really convinced Will wasn't going to enjoy it. So I told him he'd already purchased it, but I was like, no, I don't think this is going to be your cup of tea. And I bailed on page 84, but Will really loved it and it turned into one of his favourite books of the moment. So just tell me a little bit about why you wanted to pick The Plague and talk about The Plague.
Reason behind wanting to pick The Plague, I think, is fairly obvious. I think one thing, interestingly, that this festival has done is actually opened a gap in my reading. I realised that actually I haven't read a lot of translated fiction, and in a sort of roundabout way, that's quite nice to know. But I think the combination of being in the situation with coronavirus and having recently read it, that's my reason behind picking it to speak about with you. I think the reason I enjoyed it, I mean, as with any book, there are many. One thing that struck me throughout was how strong it reads as a novel, as well as a kind of, I mean, he rejected being called a philosopher, but as a kind of philosophical discourse or absurdist discourse. And I found that really pleasantly surprising. I've never read any Camus before this, apart from The Outsider. And I think, you know, too long ago and too young to really be able to kind of grapple with it. So this I would kind of consider to be my first encounter, and I think I must have brought in some kind of prior bias that it was going to be a kind of deeply philosophical novel, which it is, but actually I think as well it is a really good standalone novel. On top of that, obviously the philosophical points are really interesting in terms of sort of responsibility, in terms of various allegorical meanings for the plague. It's a book that lets you apply the plague to maybe whatever you want it to. It provides a really nice framework for thinking about things like hope, responsibility, and those kinds of discussions. And it's beautifully written. My sister studies French and we've been speaking about him a lot, and actually she doesn't believe that he translates particularly well, which I think is interesting given how still I found it a really beautiful book to read. So yeah, I mean, just sort of as well being surrounded by the situation with coronavirus now, I think it articulated an awful lot of things that we've all felt. Yeah.
What were some of those parallels that you felt were articulated and that you weren't seeing elsewhere?
So it's not that I haven't seen them elsewhere because they don't exist elsewhere. It's more sort of a gap in my reading as such. But it's things to do with loneliness and the way in which we are all dealing with things like separation. I think the word they most commonly use in translation is exile. And that kind of separation from both public life, but also from loved ones, and the kind of all of a sudden the lack of tenderness that we have in our lives, and you go from having intimate relationships with loved one or family member through to actually being, you know, alone without your partner. In the book, Ryu's wife is sent away to a kind of hospital or care home, so he's separated from her. People are separated from their loved ones. One of the main characters, a journalist who is in the town by kind of chance, essentially, is separated from his partner and tries on multiple occasions to escape. And I think that's where his whole kind of obsession with absurdity comes in in that these things do just happen by chance, and that tenderness and that intimacy is taken away so quickly. So that's something that I find really interesting, is discussion of what do we become when we're denied that. And I've forgotten your question.
It doesn't matter. It's the parallels between the book and the current situation. Like, obviously,
yeah, absolutely.
And it's isolation and the lockdown. And so in the book, the central characters are all enclosed in a town. So it's actually am I right in saying it's a cholera epidemic that's being described?
It is actually the bubonic plague. Well, actually, I tell a lie. It's not the bubonic plague. It shows signs of being bubonic plague, but I think it's never actually fully established if it is the bubonic plague. But it's referred to throughout as the pestilence or the plague.
I correct myself. It's based on his experiences, I think, of cholera. I think that's
and that's quite interesting as well, in that he was isolating actually in Iran because he was ill himself, and then he was sent away to France to recover. And at that time, that was when the Nazi occupation of France took place. But his wife and his mother were both still in Algeria. And so he was separated from them because obviously he couldn't leave the country and they couldn't get into the country. And so as an individual, he went through this exile and through also this physical ill health. But is then sort of, I suppose, filtering that onto an entire town. So much of what he writes about is actually indirectly autobiographical, which is, I think, why there are so many things that when we read them now feel almost prophetic. But actually that understanding isn't chance, it's personal. And that's also quite interesting to think of someone who can understand collective suffering through only having experienced collective suffering of an illness, and transporting that onto a town of people, obviously being in Nazi-occupied France. But that's another interesting thing as well, is that I think the novel is thought of as being a kind of, especially when it came out, which was I think a few months or a few years after the Nazi occupation ended, it's thought of being an allegorical novel about Nazi occupation of France. But as I said earlier, I think I'd say there are two things. So firstly, I think you can actually easily make a case for it being colonial occupation, something about the way in which obviously France was occupied by the Nazis, but also colonized much of North Africa down into Mali and other sort of, Ivory Coast and so on. But also Taru, one of the characters, talks, he has a kind of soliloquy or monologue in, I think, part 4, where he's talking about actually we all carry a plague within us, and that kind of personal plague. And it allows you, like I say, to take this idea of the plague and apply it to, I've seen it applied to Nazi occupations, colonialism, but also to late capitalism, right? You can apply it wherever you want.
It's the metaphor, isn't it? A plague can be and it is commonly used in our colloquial language. A plague on both your houses. A plague is a really common metaphor that we use all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a result, that makes his discussion of responsibility that much more interesting, because we are constantly going through a plague, no matter what the circumstances are, be it societal or be it individual. The very kind of detached logic that he uses, I think the quote is that the only way to fight the plague is through decency. And he uses the image of a schoolmaster talking about how 2 and 2 equals 4. And it's kind of cold, hard logic that he uses to justify his reasoning, I suppose, that responding to a plague, be it through one of these health teams or being through a doctor or being through, depending on the plague, kind of having that decent response and.
There was a quote, you mentioned the doctor, there was a quote that you highlighted in a different chat with me about the doctor respond. I thought that was really interesting. Do you know what I'm on about? Where the docs say, so the doctor is confronted about why is he acting, essentially, that he is, I'll let you.
I think I know what you're talking about, where I think, again, it's a conversation with Taru, who's essentially outlining that, you know, being a doctor, you always lose. You know, the only thing that we all have in common is that we all die. And I think he's essentially asking the question, do you not constantly feel like a failure? And I think, is that failure not kind of compounded by a plague? You know, the death rate is higher than usual anyway. And his kind of justification is, I think, you know, the alleviation of suffering and pride, actually. These things are logical, or they're at least presented as being logical. There's a plague going on. What do? You fight it. You know, why? It doesn't take heroism. You know, one of the characters is just a kind of civil servant who is not at all heroic, and yet does his bit to sort of create graphs and charts and to track statistics and to present those to the doctor. You know, he's not out there on the front lines, but he's putting his skills to their best use. He's not a hero, but actually, without him, it's going to be more of a struggle to fight the plague.
That's very prophetic, isn't it?
Absolutely.
In terms of reading experience, what was your reading experience going through it? Like, how was it? Like, for me, I think the reason I stopped at page 84 is I was just sort of struggling with it. I was finding it a little bit slow, and then I was sort of, you know, it was just a bit like, oh, well, do you know what? I'd like to read something fun at the moment. What?
Absolutely. I think, you know, I've read this. I'm currently on leave, furloughed, so I have a lot of time, so I can push through those kind of slower passages, and there definitely are slower passages. There are much more. There are pieces that feel much more involved with the novel, and pieces that feel much more involved with the philosophical aspects. And I think I found certainly that the pieces involved with the philosophy were much, took me much longer to get through. I had to reread them several times. But in that sense, I suppose I found them all the more gratifying. Would I be able to come home from work and pick that up and have a go at it? You know, absolutely not. Not to say that others couldn't, but that's not what I'm looking for from a book before bed. But I think I was consistently pleased and really enjoyed by, actually, like I say, just the beauty of the writing. He tracks and communicates changes of emotion using things like light and wind and these very natural elements really, really well. And I've just picked up The Stranger, and he already does the same thing, and he goes on to do it sort of throughout the novel. And, you know, the reason being that he kills the Arab being because the sun was so fierce in the sky.
Yeah.
And his use of light and writing about light is really excellent and enjoyable. And I don't think that you need to search for metaphor or allegory. You just need to enjoy those bits. You know, he's a great writer of natural occurrence.
Do you think that I entirely agree. I just entirely agree. The Stranger is one of the best books. Do you think that he structured it this way for a particular reason? Like, what do you get from the structure of it?
If I'm honest, I haven't got a sort of wholesale answer to that. I think in the same way that you would structure, say, an essay, you have your introduction, you have your discussion, you have your conclusion, loosely. And it is very much like that in terms of, you know, at the end of part one is declare a state of plague, stop, close the town, is the telegram. You know, right from the start, where we've just had rats dying in the streets, and then you move on, and then part three, I believe it is quite short, and he actually announces that that it's an interlude, or maybe it's the start of part 2. He announces that there's going to be an interlude to acknowledge certain things that haven't yet need to be acknowledged, but that do need to be acknowledged. So it might have actually been a tool that helps him write it in that sense, as much as it is for us to read it. But the arc is very obvious from the parts. Yeah. If anything as well, I mean, I find things like chapters and parts quite useful when reading. Not that I give myself a deadline or something, but sort of I have an idea, like I'd like to read part 2 and 3 today or something. You know, those set in stone marks that are put there by the writer, I allow myself to use them. I think they're there to be used.
Yeah. Is there anything in particular that you really wanted to touch on that we haven't looked at already?
I think 2 things that I think are quite linked. And firstly is I rarely have read a book that's like I've asked so many questions about. And I think that the questions that it asks around things like justice and responsibility can be answered by yourself. I don't necessarily think it's a book that you need to read around an awful lot. That's one of the nice things about the plague being identifiable with anything, is that you can put your own personal meaning there. It's almost the reverse of what he did. You know, so I like that. But one particular thing I've been thinking about is the idea of hope. We're living in a time that is maybe devoid of hope for whatever reason.
Wow, you're so insightful.
I don't think that is insightful. I think
no, that's exactly what I mean. I'm not sure that is insightful either.
No, not at all. But the whole idea around, you know, hope and setting yourself up for a fall, and the kind of blind nothingness that causes a plague to happen, is quite interesting. And should we allow ourselves to hope? And that's where I don't think Camus believes in hope.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I know he doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And that's got me questioning my own relationship with hope.
You can say
I have a relationship with hope, but it's just, you know, you can see the cogs whirring about, like, you know, should I be as hopeful as I am? How do you approach a situation where you feel like hope might get you through? Is hope actually practical? Is hope the best way to spend our time? You know, nothing else has made me think about that in any other way. So, you know, I think, and responsibility as well. And I think of myself as being very, if not irresponsible, then certainly someone who shies from it. But actually, if responsibility comes from decency, and decency is something that we all have within us, and it's all reachable, then all of a sudden being responsible feels an awful lot less scary.
Yeah.
If you can substitute responsibility for decency, if you can define responsibility as doing the decent thing, then actually that's not scary. I try to evade responsibility, but I try to do the decent thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a lovely note. Is there anything to add about the translation in particular? When you're asking your sister, like, did she have anything in particular to add?
So we spoke actually a lot more about the stranger or the outsider, and because that is written.
If anyone doesn't know, that there's a sort of, the way Camus' books are written, there's a trilogy of fiction that corresponds to a trilogy of non-fiction, and the trilogy of fiction, and just in case anyone was asked, couldn't find this on the internet somehow, is The Plague, The Fall, and The Outsider.
Yeah. So we spoke a lot more about that, and that is written in the imperfect and perfect tense. And a lot of French fiction is written, or the vast majority is written, in the past historic. And so by writing the stranger in the perfect and imperfect, it adds to this idea of the absurd as being a rejection of social norms, and that kind of side of things as well. And I think he was sort of, a radical thinker, and I think that was quite a radical thing to do. So in terms of translation, I actually think that it doesn't necessarily translate very well, because you lose that, and she doesn't think that Camus translates well, because you lose that, and that comes as well, I think, with a degree of kind of cultural knowledge. So you might not realise what it is that you're losing. Then the other thing I think to speak about in terms of the way it's written is this idea of, in French, it is called l'écriture blanche, which I think we would translate as being something along the lines of blank verse, although that makes it sound more poetic. It was coined by Barthes, I think, Roland Barthes, and he was talking, it's like a journalistic style of writing. And objectivity is actually something that I think Camus goes for quite a lot in The Plague, in that he keeps the narrator a secret, and he actually explains that, the narrator is revealed right at the end. He explains that the reason he's done it is to provide something of a historical account, and not something that is bound up with emotion, and bound up with kind of subjectivity. And that in itself, I think, links to those conversations around, logic for 2 + 2 = 4, and the best way in which to get something across in a logical manner without the kind of involvement of human emotion.
So when you say that, my first impression is to react quite negatively, because I think that a lot of times when people are asked to cut out emotion, it's men speaking to women to cut out emotion from their tales and things like that. And in dystopian fiction, I have a real issue with sort of how often historically you had men narrating, and you sort of get just because dystopian fiction I know quite a bit about, that tends to be certain narratives that dominate, like the man versus the state, that don't dominate when women write dystopian fiction. Like, for example, Margaret Atwood, The Handmaid's Tale, that happens in a really domestic space. So in the same way, do you think that it is obviously it is of Camus that he wrote it, but do you think that that maybe limits it, or do you think that this is just one complementary story to a whole?
Limited in the sense that there isn't much descriptive.
Well, limited that you can cut out emotions. Is it a good thing that he cut out emotions, or actually could we gain something from seeing that emotions? Maybe this isn't the story.
I don't necessarily think that emotion is cut out of the story. I think that emotion is cut out of the narrator. So when you read it, you certainly feel things. There are long descriptions. There's a long description of one of the characters' young children dying. And that is a very emotive passage, and you feel emotion as a reader. The idea is not to read it, or at least I don't think the idea is to read it as a kind of, and to feel nothing. I think, and correct me if I'm missing the point here, because I somewhat feel that I am.
No, I don't think so.
But I think I want to say that when you read something objective, or that reads objectively, you are that much more inclined to believe it. And that by going for a more objective voice, he's trying to impress the truth. Maybe it's a bit sly, because obviously absurdism and existentialism, these things are opinions and so on. But I don't think it's a story that lacks emotion. I think the way in which he provides emotion is just not through the word.
I think this ties back quite nicely, right? In that, like, essentially what I was getting at is that is this one, obviously it's one it's just his story, and there are other stories out there that are complementary narratives. But I guess my question, not necessarily to you, but my question to us as readers and what we like seek to do in our reading, is to choose to complement those narratives, so that sort of like this is Camus' truth and this is Camus' narrative, but that those have to be complemented by other people's, in particular, voices that aren't.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to take it as gospel and to subscribe to the absurd would be a weird life. No, absolutely. Obviously, you need to supplement it with kind of other readings, and to take it as kind of objective truth is. I don't necessarily think that his theory. I think you can draw from it. I think to take from it entirely is quite. That would be brave, and I think you'd be quite lonely. Yeah.
Will's
No, absolutely. And actually, the discussion of gender is a short one with this book. That is something to note as well, is that there are 2 women of significance to the plot, and then maybe a third of no significance to the plot. And it is that, as you were saying earlier, it's not man versus state. It's, I suppose, at its fundamental, it's man versus man, man versus life, man versus nature.
There's this understanding of precariousness, isn't there? So there's, I think her name is Isabella Lovey, and she's writing a really interesting book I would recommend, published by Verso Books, that is all about the instability of work, and it's something I'm really interested in. But she defines precarity on sort of these 3 different levels, and your very starting definition of precarity is kind of the level on which we're all equal. We're all equally vulnerable to a plague. We're all equally human and die, and these kinds of situations in which we're equal. And then the next level of precarity is the ways in which people have changed and taken resources and changed power dynamics so as to make that themselves safer. So the people in power want to sort of protect themselves from this fundamental level of precarity, and I think that's maybe what you were talking about.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. Nothing more to add. You're reading.
Would you like to say anything to conclude about the plague? No. Well, there we go. Thank you very much, Will.
Round of very much for having me. Thank you. Yeah.
No, and Will has been like a really great help during this time, setting up this festival. So I'm sure you'll be seeing more of him.
Thank you very much. I'm sure if you watch the time-lapse video, you'll conclude otherwise.
Bye.
Bye-bye.